Imagine a battlefield where 3,800 enemy tanks are reduced to burning scrap metal in exactly 100 hours. That is not a battle. That is an industrial-scale dismantling of a modern, mechanized army. When the ground war of Operation Desert Storm kicked off in February 1991, the world held its breath. Military analysts expected a bloodbath. We were told the Iraqi Army was the fourth largest in the world, a battle-hardened force of over 1 million men, entrenched in the desert, waiting behind massive berms and minefields to bleed American forces dry. Instead, what unfolded was the most lopsided armored engagement in human history. It was a violent, high-speed collision between a 20th-century static defense doctrine and a 21st-century digital hunter-killer force. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into the sand, the steel, and the depleted uranium of this historic campaign, I want to ask you a question. If you were commanding a tank battalion in a completely featureless desert, blind in the dark, and you knew the enemy outnumbered you 3-1, what would be your primary tactical advantage? Drop your answers in the comments below. If you enjoy deep-dive military analysis, tactical breakdowns, and historical battlefield reconstructions, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a briefing. To understand how 3,800 tanks were vaporized in 4 days, we cannot just look at the starting line in 1991. We have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic routes that built this Iraqi juggernaut and the American military machine that was purpose-built to destroy it. For 8 brutal years, from 1980 to 1988, Iraq was locked in a grinding, horrific war of attrition with Iran. Saddam Hussein threw everything his country had into the meat grinder of the Iran-Iraq war. This was a conflict defined by World War I-style trench systems, massive artillery barrages, chemical weapons, and static defensive lines. The Iraqi army learned how to dig in. They learned how to construct elaborate defensive belts, massive sand berms, and complex fire trenches filled with crude oil, ready to be ignited to block enemy armor. By the end of that war, the Iraqi military machine was massive, boasting over 1 million men under arms, 55 divisions, and a colossal armored corps of nearly 5,500 tanks. They had survived 8 years of brutal combat, which gave them a dangerous illusion. They believed they were masters of modern warfare. But there is a fatal flaw in fighting an 8-year war against a technologically inferior, tactically stagnant enemy like Iran. You learn all the wrong lessons. The Iraqis mastered the art of the static defense, but they utterly failed to grasp the concept of maneuver warfare, combined arms integration, and deep strike logistics. When Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, he fundamentally miscalculated the geopolitical reality of the post-Cold War world. He assumed the United States, still carrying the lingering psychological scars of the Vietnam War, would not have the stomach to deploy 500,000 troops halfway across the world to fight for a tiny, oil-rich emirate. He thought he could absorb Kuwait, control 20% of the world's oil reserves, and dictate terms to the Middle East. He was wrong. The United States did not just bring an army to the Saudi desert. We brought the specific army that had spent the last 40 years preparing for Armageddon. Throughout the Cold War, the entire focus of the United States military, and specifically the United States Army and Air Force, was stopping a massive Soviet armored thrust through the Fulda Gap in West Germany. We spent trillions of dollars developing weapons, tactics, and doctrines designed to defeat endless waves of Soviet T-72 tanks. We developed the AirLand Battle doctrine, a revolutionary concept that synchronized close air support, deep interdiction strikes, and highly mobile armored columns to paralyze an enemy's command structure and destroy their rear echelons before the frontline forces even knew what hit them. We built the M1 Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter, and the A-10 Warthog, specifically to kill Soviet armor. And suddenly, in the deserts of the Middle East, we found ourselves facing an army equipped entirely with Soviet export armor, utilizing rigid Soviet command structures and deploying static Soviet defensive doctrines. It was as if the enemy we had prepared to fight in the forests of Europe had conveniently relocated to a flat, featureless desert with zero civilian collateral, perfectly suited for long-range gunnery and massive armored maneuvers. Let us break down the exact force comparison, because the numbers on paper tell a story of a seemingly even fight, while the technological reality tells a story of an impending slaughter. On the Iraqi side, the tip of the spear was the Republican Guard. These were Saddam's elite, the politically reliable, better trained, and better equipped divisions. The armored core of the Republican Guard consisted of the Hammurabi, the Medina, and the Tawakkalna mechanized divisions. Their primary battle tank was the T-72 M1. To the untrained eye, the T-72 is a menacing machine. It features a low profile, a 125mm smoothbore gun, and an autoloader that reduces the crew to 3 men. But the Iraqi T-72 M1 was what the Soviets called a monkey model. It was a downgraded export version. It lacked the composite armor of the frontline Soviet tanks, relying instead on conventional steel armor that was completely inadequate against modern anti-tank munitions. More importantly, it lacked modern fire control systems and thermal imaging. The Iraqi tank commanders relied on active infrared searchlights to see at night. To an American tank equipped with passive thermal sights, turning on an active infrared searchlight is like turning on a giant neon sign in a pitch-black room that says, "Please shoot me right here." Their ammunition was also severely lacking. The Iraqis were firing the 3 BM-9 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding Sabo round, an obsolete steel core penetrator that was entirely incapable of penetrating the frontal armor of an American Abrams, even at point-blank range. Below the Republican Guard, the regular Iraqi Army was equipped with even older hardware, primarily thousands of T-62 and T-55 tanks. These were relics of the 1960s, completely outclassed in every conceivable metric. The Iraqi tactical doctrine was to dig these tanks into the sand, burying them up to their turrets to create hardened pillboxes. Why is this a catastrophic idea? Because the single greatest asset of a tank is its mobility. When you bury a tank in the sand, you strip away its ability to maneuver, you blind its driver, and you turn a mobile weapons platform into a static target waiting for artillery or air support to find its grid coordinate. Now let us look at the coalition forces, spearheaded by the United States Army's 7th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Frederick Franks. 7th Corps was the heavy armor fist of the American military, known as the Jayhawk Corps. It consisted of the 1st Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and the British 1st Armored Division. Supporting them was the 18th Airborne Corps, which included the heavily armed 24th Infantry Division under the command of General Barry McCaffrey, tasked with the deepest, fastest flanking maneuver of the war. The primary weapon of the American armored thrust was the M1A1 Abrams main battle tank. At nearly 70 tons, the Abrams was a steel leviathan. It was powered by a Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine engine. While the Iraqi tanks rumbled on conventional diesel engines, the Abrams sounded like a jet aircraft, capable of propelling 70 tons of armor at speeds exceeding 45 miles per hour across open desert. The armor of the M1A1 heavy armor variant incorporated a mesh of depleted uranium, making it virtually impenetrable to any weapon in the Iraqi arsenal. But the true lethality of the Abrams lay in its gun and its eyes. It was armed with the M256 120mm smoothbore gun, firing the M829A1 depleted uranium sabot round. This round was quickly nicknamed the Silver Bullet by American tank crews. It was a 10-pound dart of ultra-dense metal traveling at over a mile a second. When a depleted uranium penetrator strikes a Soviet-made tank, the physics are terrifying. The sheer kinetic energy turns the armor into a liquid state. The penetrator sheds its outer layers to stay razor-sharp as it pushes through the steel. And once inside the crew compartment, the depleted uranium ignites, creating a catastrophic storm of spalling, fire, and overpressure. Because Soviet tanks like the T-72 store their ammunition in a carousel directly under the turret, a penetrating hit almost always results in a catastrophic ammunition detonation, instantly vaporizing the crew and blowing the multi-ton turret dozens of feet into the air. This is the infamous Jack-in-the-Box effect. The eyes of the Abrams were the ANV-SG-2 tank thermal sights. While the Iraqis were blind in the dark, American gunners could see the heat signatures of Iraqi tanks, trucks, and personnel from miles away, regardless of darkness, smoke, or sandstorms. The effective engagement range of an Iraqi T-72 was roughly 1,500 to 1,800 meters in broad daylight. An American Abrams could routinely identify and destroy targets at 2,500 to 3,000 meters in pitch-black conditions while moving at 30 miles per hour. It was not a fight, it was an execution. But having the best tanks in the world means absolutely nothing if you cannot get them to the fight. And this brings us to the most unglamorous, yet most vital aspect of the entire campaign: logistics. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Moving 7th Corps and 18th Airborne Corps into position for the ground assault was a logistical miracle that rivals General George Patton's redirection of the 3rd Army during the Battle of the Bulge. The M1 Abrams is a thirsty beast. It does not measure fuel efficiency in miles per gallon, it measures it in gallons per mile. A single Abrams consumes roughly 3 gallons of jet fuel for every mile it travels. An entire armored division consumes hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel every single day, not to mention the hundreds of tons of ammunition, water, spare parts, and food required to keep the men and machines fighting. The United States military had to build an iron mountain of supplies in the Saudi desert. Under the command of logistics genius General Gus Pagonis, the coalition moved over 120,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, and millions of tons of supplies across 300 miles of featureless desert just to reach their jump-off points near the Iraqi border. They did this in complete radio silence, maintaining strict operational security, hiding a force of 250,000 men from Iraqi intelligence. How do you hide an army of that size? You blind the enemy first. For 39 days before the ground war started, the coalition unleashed the most devastating precision-guided air campaign in military history. They destroyed Iraqi radar sites, command and control bunkers, supply lines, and artillery parks. They established total air supremacy, meaning Iraqi commanders had absolutely no aerial reconnaissance. Saddam Hussein was fighting blind, death, and paralyzed. The terrain itself was a formidable enemy. The desert along the Saudi-Iraqi border was a vast, unbroken expanse of sand and gravel. Historically, navigating this terrain without landmarks was nearly impossible, often resulting in units wandering miles off course. But the United States Army brought a new, highly classified tool to the battlefield: the Global Positioning System. Using commercial Trimble GPS receivers, affectionately called sluggers, American commanders knew their exact coordinates down to the meter. They could coordinate massive armored formations, aligning hundreds of tanks on a precise axis of advance across a featureless landscape in the middle of the night. The Iraqis had no idea where they were, while the Americans knew exactly where everyone was. The technological overmatch here is staggering, reminiscent of the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, where British Maxim guns slaughtered thousands of Mahdist warriors, or the Marianas Turkey Shoot in World War II, where superior American radar and aircraft decimated Japanese naval aviation. When you combine a battle-hardened, highly trained volunteer military with revolutionary thermal optics, depleted uranium munitions, impenetrable armor, and flawless GPS navigation, you do not just get a victory, you get a paradigm shift in the history of warfare. By late February, the air campaign had softened the Iraqi defenses, but the Republican Guard remained entrenched in the deep desert, holding their ground, waiting for the frontal assault they believed was coming straight up the coast into Kuwait. They were looking the wrong way. Deep in the western desert, hundreds of miles from where Saddam thought the attack would come, thousands of American tank engines whined to life, their turbine engines kicking up massive plumes of sand. The famous left hook was in motion, and the greatest armored slaughter of the 20th century was about to begin. At 0400 hours on February 24, 1991, the ground war commenced, not with a cavalry charge under a blazing desert sun, but in a miserable, freezing downpour. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rain turned the fine desert dust into a thick, clinging mud. For the men of the United States 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, the weather was just another obstacle to smash through. Their mission was to breach the Saddam Line, a terrifyingly deep defensive belt of minefields, razor wire, anti-tank ditches, and sand berms that stretched for miles. How do you push an armored division through a mile-deep minefield covered by enemy artillery? You do not tiptoe. You blow the door completely off its hinges. This is where the combat engineers took center stage, utilizing a brutal piece of technology known as the M58 Miklik, or mine-clearing line charge. The Miklik is essentially a rocket towing a 350-foot nylon rope packed with over 3,200 pounds of C4 explosive. When fired across a minefield, the rocket drags the explosive line through the air. It drops to the dirt and detonates with a concussive wave so violent it triggers or destroys every pressure-sensitive mine within a lane 26 feet wide and 100 meters long. The ground shook, the sky lit up in blinding flashes of orange, and the shock waves shattered the eardrums of the Iraqi defenders hunkered down in their bunkers. Once the lanes were blown, the M9 armored combat earthmovers and Abrams tanks equipped with heavy mine plows roared through the smoke. They did not stop to clear the Iraqi fire trenches. They simply dropped their blades and bulldozed thousands of tons of sand directly into the trenches, burying the defensive lines and, in many cases, burying the Iraqi defenders alive. It was a cold, industrial efficiency that mirrored the mechanized breakout of Operation Cobra in Normandy in 1944, where American armor finally smashed through the thick hedgerows of the French countryside. But here in the desert, the speed of the breakout was unprecedented. Once the berms were breached, the heavy armor of VII Corps poured into the Iraqi rear, executing the famous left hook. Leading this massive armored wedge was not the heavy Abrams tanks, but the scouts of the cavalry regiments, specifically operating the M3 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicle. To understand the slaughter that followed, we must dissect the Bradley. On paper, it is a lightly armored personnel carrier, but in the hands of American cavalrymen, it was an apex predator. The Bradley was armed with a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun, capable of firing 200 rounds a minute. It fired depleted uranium armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds that could punch straight through the frontal armor of an Iraqi BMP infantry fighting vehicle and turn the crew into mist. But the Bradley's true tank-killing capability came from its TOW missile system. TOW stands for tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided. When a Bradley gunner fired a TOW, a massive 50-pound missile blasted out of the launch tube, spooling out 2 microscopic copper wires behind it. As long as the American gunner kept his crosshairs on the targeting computer sent flight corrections down those literal wires to the missile, steering it perfectly into the enemy armor at ranges exceeding 2 miles. The Iraqi counter to this was the Soviet-made Saga anti-tank missile. The Saga was a relic of the 1970s. To fire a Saga, an Iraqi gunner had to stand perfectly still, look through a small optic, and manually fly the missile using a tiny joystick, much like a vintage video game. Imagine trying to manually fly a missile with a joystick while an American Abrams tank is firing 50 caliber machine gun tracers and high explosive rounds directly at your face. The psychological pressure made the Saga virtually useless in a mechanized firefight. By February 25th, the Iraqi High Command realized the main attack was not coming from the coast, but from the deep western desert. They ordered the Republican Guard to pivot and establish a defensive line to stop the American juggernaut. And then, the battlefield environment threw a massive curveball. A shamal, a violent northwestern wind, swept across the desert, bringing a massive sandstorm. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. The wind howled at 40 miles per hour, whipping sand so hard it stripped the paint off the hulls of the American vehicles. Iraqi commanders breathed a sigh of relief. According to Soviet doctrine and basic human logic, you cannot fight an armored battle in a blinding sandstorm. They assumed the Americans would halt, circle their wagons, and wait for the weather to clear. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? In a storm that strips the paint off your vehicle. You switch on the thermals and you keep driving. The American thermal imaging systems cut through the sandstorm like a hot knife through butter. The sand actually cooled the ambient temperature of the desert floor, which made the hot metal of the Iraqi tank engines and the body heat of their crews glow even brighter on the green screens of the American gunners. This technological asymmetry culminated on the afternoon of February 26th in a patch of featureless desert designated on military maps simply as 73 Easting. This would become the site of the last great tank battle of the 20th century. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was acting as the eyes and ears of 7th Corps, probing eastward through the blinding sandstorm. Leading the charge was Eagle Troop, commanded by a young captain named H.R. McMaster. McMaster was commanding a force of 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks and 12 Bradley fighting vehicles. Waiting for them in the swirling dust was a brigade of the Tawakalna Division, Saddam's elite Republican Guard. The Iraqis had set up a textbook reverse slope defense. This is a tactic as old as warfare itself, famously used by the Duke of Wellington to defeat Napoleon at Waterloo and heavily utilized by American forces in the Korean War. You position your forces just behind the crest of a slight ridge. When the enemy drives over the top, they are silhouetted against the sky, and you engage them at point-blank range. It was a brilliant tactical setup by the Iraqi commander, perfectly suited for the terrain. But it had a fatal flaw. The Iraqi commander did not realize that the American thermals could see the exhaust plumes of his idling tanks wafting over the top of the ridge. As Captain McMaster's tank crested the slight rise at 73 Easting, he suddenly found himself staring directly into the gun barrels of an entire Iraqi armored brigade, dug in just 800 yards away. In tank warfare, 800 yards is a knife fight in a phone booth. There was no time to call for artillery. There was no time to call for air support. McMaster barked the order to fire. Inside the Abrams, the choreography of violence is a masterclass in human engineering. Unlike the Soviet tanks with their mechanical autoloaders, the Abrams relies on a human loader. A human loader in an American tank can pull a 40-pound, 3-foot-long shell from the blast doors, slam it into the breech, arm the gun, and scream up in less than 3 seconds. The Iraqi autoloader took a minimum of 7 seconds to cycle. In a tank duel, 4 seconds is the difference between going home to your family and burning to death in a steel coffin. McMaster's gunner lazed the first target and fired. The depleted uranium sabot round slammed into an Iraqi T-72, instantly detonating its ammunition carousel. The turret blew 50 feet into the air in a massive fireball. Within 10 seconds, McMaster's tank had destroyed 2 more Iraqi tanks. The rest of Eagle Troop crested the ridge and unleashed a wall of fire. It was a slaughter. The Iraqis fought bravely, returning fire with everything they had, but their rounds simply bounced off the heavy, depleted uranium armor of the Abrams, or missed completely because they were firing blind into the sandstorm. In exactly 23 minutes, Eagle Troop's 9 tanks destroyed nearly 50 Iraqi armored vehicles. They did not lose a single man or a single tank. But the ground forces were not acting alone. Above the swirling sandstorm prowled the most terrifying close air support aircraft ever built. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog. The Warthog is not so much an airplane as it is a massive rotary cannon with wings bolted onto it. That cannon is the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm Gatling gun that fires uranium-depleted, armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. When an A-10 rolled in on an Iraqi tank formation, the tank crews on the ground would see the explosions ripping their vehicles apart before they ever heard the iconic, terrifying sound of the gun. Working in tandem with the A-10s were the AH-64 Apache attack helicopters. The Apaches hovered miles away, hiding behind sand dunes, popping up just long enough to paint an Iraqi tank with a laser and ripple-fire Hellfire missiles. This tactic became known as tank plinking. What happens to a tank crew's morale when the vehicle next to them violently explodes and the sky is completely empty? They break. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers simply abandoned their multi-million-dollar machines, realizing that staying inside a tank was a guaranteed death sentence. We must also understand the grueling physical toll this took on the American crews. They were not just fighting a war, They were fighting in full MOPP gear, mission-oriented, protective posture. Because Saddam Hussein had heavily utilized chemical weapons against Iran and his own people, every American soldier assumed chemical artillery shells were incoming. They fought wearing thick, charcoal-lined chemical protective suits, heavy rubber boots, rubber gloves, and gas masks. Inside the cramped, unair-conditioned hull of an Abrams tank, the temperature routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The crews were exhausted, severely dehydrated, drinking warm water from plastic canteens, and operating on zero sleep for days on end. Yet, the adrenaline of the mechanized blitzkrieg kept them pushing forward. By the night of February 26th, the Tawakalna Division had been utterly erased from the order of battle. The American VII Corps had punched a massive hole right through the center of the Republican Guard's defensive line. But the war was not over. As the 1st Armored Division, consisting of over 3,000 vehicles, moving in a massive armored wedge, pushed deeper into the Iraqi rear, they were heading straight for the Medina Division. The Medina was the absolute pride of Saddam's military, equipped with the best, pristine armor they had left. And unlike the Tawakalna, the commander of the Medina Division had learned from the slaughter at 73 Easting. He had pulled his forces back, found a massive natural ridgeline, and set up a kill zone designed specifically to negate the American thermal advantage, waiting patiently for the 1st Armored Division to drive right into the jaws of the trap. The commander of the Medina Division had done his homework. He positioned his heavy armor, primarily pristine T-72 tanks, on the backside of a long, subtle desert fold known as Medina Ridge. This was a textbook reverse-slope defense, designed to force the advancing American tanks to drive up the ridge and silhouette themselves against the sky. By waiting until the American tanks crested the hill, the Iraqi commander hoped to negate the extreme range advantage of the Abrams 120mm main gun, forcing a close-quarters brawl where his inferior optics and older ammunition might actually stand a chance. It was a sound tactical plan, rooted in solid defensive doctrine. But how do you spring a trap when the enemy can see the trap being built from 50 miles away? The Iraqi High Command had completely failed to comprehend the new God's eye view of the American military intelligence apparatus. Orbiting high above the Saudi and Iraqi airspace was a highly classified, newly deployed aircraft called the Boeing E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, or JSTARS. The JSTARS was a modified Boeing 707 airliner carrying a massive 24-foot synthetic aperture radar canoe under its fuselage. This radar was so powerful it could track the movement of individual enemy tanks, supply trucks, and troop columns over an area of nearly 20,000 square miles in real time, regardless of weather or darkness. Major General Ron Griffith, commanding the United States 1st Armored Division, did not need to guess what was on the other side of Medina Ridge. His intelligence officers were looking at live radar tracks of the entire Medina Division sitting in their defensive positions. When the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division approached the ridge, they did not charge blindly over the crest like the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. They halted, formed a massive battle line spanning miles of desert, and picked up the radio. Before a single American tank fired its main gun, the sky tore open. The coalition unleashed the M270 multiple-launch rocket system, a weapon so devastating the Iraqi infantry surrendered to the drones that spotted for it, referring to the rockets as steel rain. A single M270 launcher carries 12 rockets. Each rocket is packed with 644 M77 dual-purpose improved conventional submunitions. When a battery of these launchers fires, they can blanket a 1 square kilometer grid with nearly 8,000 high-explosive armor-piercing bomblets in less than 60 seconds. The reverse slope of Medina Ridge instantly became a churning meat grinder of shrapnel, fire, and detonating ammunition. Following the artillery barrage, AH-64 Apaches swept over the ridge, ripple-firing laser-guided Hellfire missiles into the surviving Iraqi air defense vehicles and command tracks. Only then did the Abrams tanks crest the ridge. But they did not drive down into the valley to fight at close range. They stayed at the top of the ridge, utilizing their thermal sights to peer through the smoke and burning wreckage, picking off the remaining Iraqi T-72s at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. In a span of just 45 minutes, the 1st Armored Division destroyed 348 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles. The American losses at Medina Ridge were exactly 1 Abrams tank and 1 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicle, both struck by friendly fire in the chaos of the massive engagement. This staggering asymmetry forces us to look back at the history of armored warfare to understand just how fundamentally the paradigm had shifted. Consider the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where the Soviet Union built massive, miles-deep defensive belts to stop the German Panzer Blitzkrieg. At Kursk, the static defense worked because both sides were fighting with roughly equivalent technology, relying on line-of-sight optics and conventional armor. Saddam Hussein attempted to replicate that mid-20th century Soviet doctrine, but he deployed it against a 21st century digital force. It was the equivalent of bringing a musket to a machine gun fight. To find a historical precedent for this level of information dominance, you have to look at the Battle of Midway in 1942. At Midway, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz the exact location and timetable of the Japanese carrier strike force. That intelligence allowed a numerically inferior American fleet to ambush and destroy the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In Desert Storm, the J-Stars, AWACS, and satellite reconnaissance provided that exact same level of total situational awareness, but on a continental scale, tracking hundreds of thousands of ground troops in real time. But winning a battle of this magnitude requires more than just microchips and depleted uranium. It requires a logistical tether that borders on the miraculous. By the 3rd day of the ground offensive, the American VII Corps was advancing so fast that they were literally driving off the edges of their tactical maps. General Gus Pagonis and his logistics command were performing a high-wire act over a bottomless pit. Heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, or HEMTTs, carrying thousands of gallons of volatile aviation fuel, were driving at breakneck speeds across open desert, navigating through uncleared minefields, and dodging burning Iraqi vehicles just to keep the Abrams tanks fueled. If the fuel trucks stopped, the armored blitzkrieg stopped. And they were doing this in a man-made environmental apocalypse. As the Iraqi army realized they were being annihilated, Saddam Hussein ordered a scorched earth policy of unfathomable proportions. Iraqi combat engineers rigged explosives to over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells and detonated them. The result was a literal hell on earth. Millions of barrels of crude oil burned every single day, sending columns of thick, toxic black smoke into the stratosphere. The smoke was so dense it blocked out the sun, turning the desert day into a freezing, pitch-black night. American soldiers fought in a toxic rain of unburned oil droplets that coated their chemical suits, their weapons, and the optics of their tanks. The Honeywell gas turbine engines of the Abrams tanks, sucking in massive amounts of air to generate power, were choking on the heavy soot and fine desert sand. Tank crews had to constantly dismount in the middle of a war zone, in zero visibility, to manually blast the dirt out of their engine air filters, using compressed air hoses, just to keep their 70-ton machines moving forward. By February 27th, the strategic picture for the Iraqi military had collapsed, from a fighting retreat into a completely disorganized, panicked rout. Thousands of stolen civilian vehicles, military trucks, and surviving tanks bottlenecked on Highway 80, the main road leading out of Kuwait City back to the Iraqi border. This traffic jam of retreating forces created what became known to history as the Highway of Death. American air power, specifically A-10 Warthogs, F-111 Aardvarks, and Navy attack jets, descended on the miles-long column. They bombed the front of the convoy to halt it, bombed the rear of the convoy to trap it, and then systematically destroyed every single vehicle in between. The destruction was absolute, leaving thousands of charred, twisted vehicles littering the highway. But here is where the brutal calculus of mechanized warfare collides with the delicate realities of geopolitics. The imagery of the Highway of Death, broadcast on global television networks like CNN, was horrific. It did not look like war anymore. It looked like a massacre. In Washington, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, and President George H.W. Bush faced a massive strategic dilemma. The Powell Doctrine dictated the use of overwhelming, decisive military force to achieve a clear political objective, followed by a rapid exit strategy. The United Nations mandate was strictly to liberate Kuwait, not to invade Iraq, occupy Baghdad, or overthrow Saddam Hussein. Do you continue the slaughter and march on the enemy capital, risking a protracted counterinsurgency war in the Middle East, or do you declare victory and halt the advance? President Bush chose the latter. At exactly 100 hours after the ground invasion began, a ceasefire was ordered. The final tally of the ground war is almost impossible to comprehend. In just 4 days, the coalition forces destroyed or captured 3,800 Iraqi main battle tanks, 1,400 armored personnel carriers, and nearly 2,900 artillery pieces. An estimated 80,000 Iraqi soldiers were taken prisoner, many surrendering to unarmed reconnaissance drones or news crews just to escape the relentless bombardment. In contrast, the United States suffered fewer than 150 combat deaths during the entire war, with tank losses numbering in the single digits, the majority of which were the result of friendly fire or hidden anti-tank mines. Operation Desert Storm was not just a military victory. It was the violent, undeniable validation of the American all-volunteer force, the AirLand Battle doctrine, and the massive investments in stealth, precision munitions, and digital integration made during the late Cold War. It proved that massed static armor formations were completely obsolete in the face of combined arms maneuver warfare and air supremacy. Warfare had fundamentally changed forever. It was no longer a contest of who had the thickest steel or the most men in a trench. It was now a contest of who controlled the electromagnetic spectrum, who had the clearest thermal optics, and who could process battlefield information the fastest. The era of the digital hunter-killer had arrived, and it announced itself with the destruction of the fourth largest army in the world in exactly 100 hours. Now, I want to hear from you. When you look at the absolute annihilation of the Iraqi armored forces during Desert Storm, What do you believe was the single most decisive factor in the coalition's lopsided victory? A. The overwhelming technological superiority of the M1 Abrams and its thermal optics. B. The total air supremacy and the devastating close air support of the A-10 Warthog and Apache helicopters. C. The flawless logistical execution that kept the massive armored thrust moving across the desert. Drop your vote, A, B, or C, and your reasoning in the comments below.